All right, folks, it is February 26th, 2 days before exam number one. The excitement is palpable. Let's go ahead and start talking about this exam because we have a lot of stuff to cover, and I expect dozens, if not singles, of questions. Let's see. So first of all, some advice, just general speaking, as far as the exam goes. Please make sure you show up early if possible. You may have classes before this, and that's fine. You can't show up early. I try to start the exams a few minutes early just to make sure there's plenty of time to complete the exam. Most of the people in this room, I anticipate you will finish well before the time is allotted, but just in case you need that extra time, give that extra minutes. We do have a class in this. Well, actually, maybe we don't have a class right after this one, so it can run a little bit long. Usually there's a class, but it's also, I think it's the 1 hour BSA D1 degree class on Fridays. So we may have a little bit extra time, but be planning on 50-minute exam. I mentioned this before, but please bring a pencil and an eraser. If you bring a pen to write with, it can get a little bit awkward if you need to change your answer. That does happen frequently. People want to change their answer, and it gets really, really, really awkward. You want to change it back. So pencil and eraser is what I prefer. You can't do that. You can try to take it with a pen. Just be very, very certain that when you put your final answer in, it's correct. As far as the breakdown of the exam goes, there are going to be 20 multiple choice questions, which I will give you details on what you expect in those here in just a moment. 14 of those multiple choice questions will come from the chapter lectures that we have. So that's going to be 2 questions from each chapter because we covered 7 chapters. There will be 4 Excel questions and 2 NetSuite questions. So we'll talk a little bit more about the details of those individually here in just a second. So 14 chapter questions, 2 Excel questions, or sorry, 4 Excel questions, 2 NetSuite questions. All right. Beyond that, let's talk about the problem. There's one problem on the exam. That one problem, it's going to have very similar in format to the one that's on the practice exam, but let me go ahead and make sure that everybody's clear on that. The first part of the problem will be creation of a BPMN diagram. And I will tell you right now, do not try to overcomplicate this. It will be very similar to the BPMN diagrams that are from your chapters 5, 6, and 7. If you can replicate those diagrams, you should feel pretty good about where you stand. Associated with that, remember I told you in the BPMN diagrams, you do have to be able to identify transaction points. So not only should you be able to create the BPMN diagram, but you should be able to identify where the transactions occur. And you need to replicate the journal entries. These will be simple form journal entries, not complex form journal entries. So you don't need to include tax effects. You don't have to worry if you want to know the difference between purchase and inventory. I just want to make sure you have a general understanding of what the journal entries look like. So please make sure you can replicate the journal entries of those points. So those are the transaction points. That's the first part. The second part is the UML analysis. There will be a UML question, despite everybody just wanting to avoid UML as possible. I respect that, but I do think it's important. Basically, you do need to know your UML diagrams at the detailed level. So remember when we went through chapters 5, 6, and 7, I said make sure you can replicate this diagram. And those are fairly high-level diagrams. You should know all the details of the UML diagram. I will tell you right now, as far as replication goes, if I ask you to replicate a diagram, I will not insist that you include the multiplicities. That's not saying the multiplicities are important, but that's just a lot of information. So if I ask you to fully replicate a diagram, it will not include all the multiplicities that are associated with the diagram. I will only do that if it's going to be a partial part of the diagram. So that's not saying that you shouldn't know that. You should be able to interpret that at any level. But there will be a question on the UML diagrams. There will be a question on multiplicity interpretation. And then there will be a question about the integrated UML diagram, which I absolutely will not ask you to replicate, but you should know enough about the integrated UML diagram that you can answer questions about it. And based on everything I've told you so far, there should be pretty conclusive hints on what you should be looking for with respect to that integrated UML diagram. I talked about it multiple times in class. That is the nature of the exam itself. Let's go and get into the details here. Like I said, I'm not going to cover every point, just the ones that I think need clarification. So let's get started on this. As far as components of the definition of a system, remember that we talked about there were two key components of that. That's input and output. So you should be able to understand how that represents. When we talk about an information system, how input and output relates to that. Something that a little bit later on says, what three categories of information should an AIS be able to capture? This is actually in the chapter 1 slide, slide number 10. There were three categories of information. Generally speaking, they relate to transactions, decision-making, and internal controls. And I didn't pull up a slide for that one, but you can find the slides online. So transactions, decision-making, and internal controls. Those are the three categories of information. And you should be able to explain the difference between those, but that shouldn't be too hard because those are all fairly self-explanatory as what they represent. I did ask a question about characteristic information, SFAC number 8. So that's statements on financial accounting concepts number 8. There's a slide, I think it's actually slide number 11, but don't quote me on that one, in chapter 1, that actually shows statement on financial accounts and concepts number 8. You do not need to know the entire slide. You do need to know the pervasive constraint of accounting information, and that has to do with the cost of the information cannot exceed the benefit of providing that information. So you want to minimize the cost of providing information with respect to financial accounting information to the level at least that the benefit of the accounting information exceeds the cost. This is a really important constraint in accounting, and it's a really important constraint with accounting information systems. Primary activities that primary roles that serve in an AIS and the secondary activities. I'm going to tell you right now, I will not ask you to list those all out. All right. There were 5 primary activities and 4 secondary activities. You don't need to list those all out. You should know the names. You should know their definitions. Okay. And should be able to acknowledge those. Probably more specifically, make sure that if I give you a sequence to know the order, that you can actually identify the order of these activities, and you can justify why the sequence. And make sure you know which ones are primary and which ones are secondary. I think this is a little bit easier than memorization. I think if you just take like 10 minutes out, or not even 10 minutes, 5 minutes out to take a look at these and get some basic knowledge about them, should have that pretty much on lockdown. This one always comes up, and I'm not sure why it's always confusing, but I want to clarify this. So supply chain management and customer relationship management, you don't need to have detailed definitions for these. One of the most important things that I wanted to clarify when we talked about this in chapter 1 is supply chain management relates to interactions with suppliers, okay? And customer relationship management relates to interactions with relationships to customers. Now, what is that? Why is that important? Okay, that's obviously self-explanatory. What do customers generally generate with respect to an organization? Revenues, and then suppliers usually generate costs, or specifically cost of goods sold, for buying inventory for them. So if we're talking about what areas of the income statement these are likely to affect, that's probably the most important thing to remember, is that supply chain management generally focuses on generation of cost of goods sold. Customer relationship management generally relates to the generation of revenues for obvious reasons, for obviously good reasons. You do have to make that linkage that one relates to suppliers, one relates to customers, but for some reason that always gets confusing, and it shouldn't be. It should be fairly intuitive as to why that's the case. All right, moving on to chapter 2. The primary purposes of AIS documentation. So first of all, make sure you understand what documentation represents at a very basic level. That's just try to identify how the system works, or what the function of the system is. But what are the primary purposes? This is chapter 2, slides 5 through 8. And loosely speaking, that's going to be represents efficiency, effectiveness, internal controls, and compliance, which compliance is basically just laws and regulations, okay? So make sure efficiency, effectiveness, internal control, compliance. That's basically all you need to remember there. Those are the functions of AIS documentation to identify the AIS role in those different areas. Moving on. So we talked about flow charting, and again, I'm not going to ask you too much detail about flow charting, but one of the things that I might ask you about is the steps of the data processing cycle captured in a flow chart. There are 4 primary steps and additional steps. 4 primary steps are IPSO, input, processing, storage, and output. And then the additional steps are flows. Those are just the flows between those process areas, okay? That kind of sets the stage for business process model notation, but I do want you to remember the IPSO and the additional flows, okay? Starting here in this section of the study guide. All of this stuff right here, spend plenty of time researching and studying this information. This is our focus of that chapter, chapter 2, and it relates to a lot of things that we talked about in later chapters. You should know every single thing in this list here very, very well. Okay, you should be able to tell me what type of events are depicted in BPO diagrams, how they're depicted, what are activities. Sequence flows, remember those actually show the activities in sequence. So it just shows what activity moves to the next. Gateway is decision point. That's the diamond. Illustrate and branch across departments or outside organizations. Those are basically going to be pools and lanes. Okay, pools are entities outside the organization. Lanes are entities with are departments within the organization. Message flows actually show interactions between lanes and pools. How do those differ? Those outside parties. Okay, remember we're talking about pools internally. They're basically just going to go from lane to lane. We're talking about outside parties that will go to across pools. Okay, this is all covered in the chapter 2 slides. I would make sure that you have strong familiarity with this information right here. So the stuff that I just highlighted, spend plenty of time doing that. If you get to that point and you're reviewing for the exam before the exam on Friday and you're saying, I'm still not sure what a message flow is, go back and research. You're still not certain, send me an email or come to office hours, one of the two. Okay. All right. Moving on to chapter 3, UML. What are classes? Classes at a very basic level is just information the organization wants detail about. Okay. Just information the organization wants detail about. What are classes used to represent UML language? There's 4 categories of classes. 3 of these you should know right off the top of your head. That's REA, resources, events, and agents. We have to know those if we're going to create a UML diagram, so it should be fairly intuitive. What is the 4th one? That's one of those items that's a class but not an entity. That's conceptual structures. Conceptual structures do not fall within the parameters of resources, events, and agents, but there's still details that an organization might want to know about. You do need to know how to depict a conceptual structure, but you won't have to diagram one. What are associations? Associations are just relationships between classes in a UML diagram. What are multiplicities? Those actually quantify those associations. Okay. You probably note when I say very important, it's probably very important for you to know, but you will need to interpret multiplicities in UML diagrams. You're related to the process areas, chapters 5, 6, and 7. There will absolutely be a question about it because I told you there's one in the problems. There may be multiple questions about this. So you should be very, very clear. Keep in mind, you do need to understand the minimum and maximum multiplicities. Also, I've talked about this multiple times, but I want to reiterate, when interpreting a multiplicity in the UML diagram, you start with the near class, the class that you're starting with. You go to the far multiplicity and then use that multiplicity to interpret the relationship. Okay. We'll actually talk about that here in just a second when we do walk through the practice exam. That's really important to depict. All right. Primary key and foreign key. There's actually several questions on this in the area. So this is actually chapter 3, starts chapter 3, slide 9. We're actually going to look at some slides here in just a second that I think are really important. So make sure you understand that. As far as definition goes, make sure you understand primary key is an attribute of combination of attributes that uniquely identifies each record. It cannot be null and blank, and it should be controlled so it will not change over time. Easy example of this is your banner ID that you use for trim and state. Okay. Also related to this definition is foreign key. Foreign key is an attribute or combination of attributes that allows tables to be linked together. So basically, it's a primary key or a combination of primary key information from another table that can be used in a different table to link those 2 tables together. Now, remember, we talked about this in detail multiple times, and we talked about it a little bit last class period. I said that if it's going to be a foreign key, it has to have a multiplicity of either 0 to 1 or 1 to 1, because it cannot have a maximum representation more than 1 if it appears more than 1 time. The reason I say 0 to 1 is it's possible it can be null. Okay, that's actually the entity integrity rule, or sorry, the referential integrity rule. It can be null, so it's possible to be 0, but it can only have a maximum of 1. So that multiplicity is really important to note. All right. By the way, in this diagram, you will notice that it says a foreign key person owns an auto. Person could actually be a foreign key in auto, but auto could not be a foreign key in person because auto could be that person could own many automobiles. So that's why this one-to-one relationship is really important to put here. All right, going back here. Let's go down to the rules for decision making. So 4 steps in decision making, not likely to be there. I would make sure you take a look at it, even though it's because on the syllabus or on the study guide, but not likely to be a detailed question. There will be questions on 3 types of business rules though, because remember there were 3 types of business rules. I think I said mandatory on Monday. It's supposed to be obligatory. I knew that I had the word wrong, but couldn't get it right on top off my tongue. So obligatory, prohibited, and allowed. So make sure you understand the differences between those types of business rules. Also note, when we talk about business rules actually create internal controls, but they're not internal controls themselves. So we identify the rule and we say, how can we actually create a control to enforce that rule? That's the idea behind internal controls, but we'll get to that in a little. All right, chapter number four. There's not a lot of variance in detail here. Chapter number 4 was kind of a compression of information we've already talked about. So power relations, entities, and attributes depicted in a relational database. Keep in mind that a entity itself is the table itself, okay? Or so the relation is the table itself. The entities are related by rows, or technically speaking, they're all instances of an entity. And then attributes are depicted by columns, okay? So this is our table, this is our rows, this is our columns, all right? That's basically how we said it. Yes.
Say that one more time, please.
Yes, so tables are they're basically represent relations. The table itself represents the relations. Entities are represented in rows. Probably more specifically is that that's all instances of an entity is a row. And then attributes are represented by columns. All right. Basic requirements of tables. All I'm just going to tell you is that if you focus on this slide right here and make sure you know all the details in this slide. This is chapter 4, slide number 14. Make sure you know everything on this slide. You should be good to go. Probably the most important ones are going to be the first 2, the integrity rule, the referential integrity rule, and then also this last one, or next to last one, we've talked about multiple times. Each attribute of a record can only have a single value. That actually dictates when we can and cannot use foreign keys. Okay, so make sure you're familiar with those. Chapter number 5. All right, there's going to be a pretty important sequence that's going to occur in the next few chapters. All right, I'm going to reiterate this really heavily in this chapter, and then I'm going to kind of passively refer to it on the next few chapters. So first of all, really important that you know the fundamental functions of every process area. All right, so you know the fundamental functions. This is really only applicable to revenue and purchasing because there's not a fundamental functional steps in the conversion process. So make sure you understand the sequence of steps that occurs in the revenue process and the purchasing process. The good news is if you memorize one, you should have the other down because it's just basically switching the roles. In this one, we're the supplier. In the purchasing process, we're the customer. So what are the fundamental functions of the revenue process? You need to know those. This should be pretty intuitive because these are what's depicted in our BPMN diagrams in this process area. All right. What are the typical transactions in the business in a business-to-business revenue cycle? That term business-to-business is really important because remember that necessitates the extension of credit. If it's a business customer, then we're actually assuming that we operate on a payment a point of sale operation. So extension of credit is going to be assumed in these transactions. Business revenue cycle, there's basically 2 primary transactions. There's the sales transaction, which actually has a corresponding cost of goods sold transaction. And there's the collection of cash, the cash receipt. So make sure you can depict both of those. BPMN revenue process diagram, you do need to be able to prepare a BPMN diagram. I said multiple times that you do need to be able to represent those. Might there be different activities from the ones that you represent? The answer is yes, but they will not be so substantially different that you will have to create a whole new diagram. If there are variations, they will be minimal. So you do need to be able to read the narrative to create the diagram, but I will tell you right now, for 99% of what you're going to be interpreting will be stuff already interpreted in previous BPMN diagrams. So if you get those diagrams down, you should feel pretty good. All right, you will need to be able to interpret and expand BPMN diagrams, but you do not need to replicate those. So when we look at bigger BPMN diagrams, especially those with multiple lanes and multiple flows, you need to interpret what's going on there, but I will not ask you to create one of those diagrams. All right, UML process diagram. You will need to prepare a UML diagram of the revenue process that includes all primary resources, events, and agents. You will notice I did not include conceptual structures there. You do not need to create a UML diagram with conceptual structures, but you will need to be responsible for interpreting all conceptual structures. You also, very important, need to be able to interpret multiplicities in the UML diagram of the revenue process. I should also mention here that even though it doesn't specifically say it, you do need to prepare all the necessary associations within the UML diagram. You can't just put the boxes up there and not the little lines in there. The lines, the associations represent the relationships between those classes. You do need to be able to dictate those as well, okay? So even though it doesn't say anything about associations, that's important parts of the UML diagrams that we're going to create. All right. Internal controls. What are some general examples of internal controls? We didn't talk about those much in revenue process, but we did allude to those. I do think you need to be able to sort of define segregation of duties because I will talk about it, and we'll talk about examples of those in each of these process areas. Remember, segregation of duties is CAR, custody, authorization, recording. We should separate the responsibilities of custody of assets, authorization of transactions, and recording of transactions. That's going to be one of the more prominent areas that we're going to talk about with respect to controls. One of the other areas we're going to talk about relate to IT controls. Two categories of IT controls: access and application controls. Access controls dictate what the employees have access to within a system. Application controls dictates what the system itself documents and provides for reference. Usually leaves an audit trail. All right. With that, let's move on to chapter 6. So chapter 6, same rules hold that we talked about before. So let me just quickly go through these. Make sure you know the fundamental functions of the purchasing process. You need to know all the steps in those. You need to know the transactions. Transactions are basically the same, except we're talking about talk about the goods receipt transaction and the cash disbursements transaction. BPMN diagram, you do need to be able to prepare a basic one. Okay, that includes transactional analysis. You need to know when these transactions occur, and you need to be able to interpret expanded BPMN diagrams. UML diagram, same rules hold as before. You need to be able to prepare a UML diagram with resource events and agents and all associations, and then interpret multiplicities and interpret conceptual structures. That's basically it. I know that I didn't spend a lot of time on here, but the same rules hold here. Even though I only spent like 30 seconds discussing that, this is really important. Make sure you can do all this stuff in this area. Okay. And then what are some basic IIS controls in the considerations in the purchasing process? Couple things to remember here. We did talk specifically about some controls in this area. Make sure you understand the difference between access and application controls in the purchasing process. And make sure you understand the difference between custody, authorization, and recording, segregation of duties in this process area. So we did talk specifically about that and some examples of that. If you remember at the end of each of these chapters, I gave you a table in the book to refer back to. I would definitely look at those tables for each of the revenue, purchasing, and conversion process for reference. Because it was a big, long table that I couldn't fit onto an entire slide. It's an electronic table that actually extends way beyond the parameters of the book. So make sure you take a look at that table for each of those chapters. All right, chapter number 7. We don't have a sequence here, but we do have transactions in the manufacturing conversion cycle. Keep in mind that the transactions are going to be those that are represented in the BPMN diagram. You don't need to worry about the payment of salaries payable. You don't need to worry about the recognition of actual overhead. You need to recognize when raw materials go into work in process. You need to recognize when labor and overhead go into work in process, and you need to recognize when work in process is completed and it transfers to finished goods. These are all things you learned back in 221. They're very easy transactions to document within journal entries. I expect you to be able to do those. All right, BPMN diagram, the conversion process. This is actually very easy. It only really has 4 activities, but you do need to be able to recognize when the transactions occur within the BPMN diagram and be able to interpret. I have that in every one to and interpret. No, I don't know why I have to and interpret here. That's to interpret and expand a BPMN diagram. Apparently, I got confused. Puzzled. BPMN diagram of the conversion process. So again, you will not need to replicate that, but you'll need to interpret it if it's a larger diagram that involves multiple departments. The good news about the conversion process is that we don't have to worry about pools. There's no multiple entities in conversion. It's all self-contained. UML diagram, same rules hold before. Make sure you can prepare UML diagram with all primary resource events and agents. You can interpret the multiplicities, interpret conceptual structures. And then an additional one, be able to interpret an integrated UML diagram of the revenue purchasing conversion process. I've told you 100% this will be on the exam, so make sure you look at it. If you feel like you want to be able to know it well enough to replicate it, that's your call. I will not ask you to replicate, but I will expect you to know that diagram fairly well. I would not waste time on trying to replicate the multiplicities within that diagram. That is massive, but at least know the associations and at least know the conceptual structures, or sorry, the classes that are represented in that diagram. Conceptual structures will not be replicated, but again, they will be up for interpretation. AI's controls consideration of the conversion process, primary rules to remember. Make sure you understand the difference between application and access controls in this area and understand how custody authorization recording is represented within the conversion process. All right. So as far as Excel goes, let me go ahead and clarify something that happens on every single exam. So on the practice exam, I did not have an example of this, and it was probably an oversight, but I want to clarify that this will 100% be the case on the exam. So I want to make sure you know. If I have a formula listed on here, make sure you know the components of the formula, okay? I'm not going to ask you to necessarily replicate the formula itself. Like I won't ask you to write a VLOOKUP function, but if I list out the VLOOKUP function, I would expect you to know within this function, what does this item in the function represent? What does this item represent? Why do we actually present that in the formula? So if you see a formula here, make sure you review the formula as it's presented in Excel, specifically as we presented it during class when we went through our Excel Fridays. There will at least be one question, if not multiple questions, that will ask you to interpret a formula. And it's going to be one of these formulas listed here, okay? A couple of notes. Depending on when you have the study guide, this is going to say concatenate. I didn't update this because I didn't concatenate in previous semesters. We did the concat formula. I think there was a practice exam question that I forgot to update as well. Do not worry, I will have it correct on the exam. There'll be reference to what we did in this course. But I put the practice exam up at the end of the semester and then changed to the concat formula. So I just wanted to make sure you know that. An example of the formulas I want to talk about. So first of all, everything that's listed up here is viable for the exam. Again, if it's a formula, make sure you know the components and you can interpret the components. An example of this, if I said, okay, in ran between, I have ran between 1 and 100. What does the 100 represent? And that you should be able to note that is the top value of the randomization function that you can actually have in the random formula. Now, that's obviously very easy interpretation. Some of the formulas are a lot more complex, but again, we did go over them in class, so please make sure you're familiar with them. All right, next week assignments. All I'm going to tell you right here is make sure you can answer all of these questions in sufficient detail. This is not everything we did in NetSuite, but this is everything that I will ask questions about, okay? Some of these were asked on the practice exam, so that should give you some clues as to what I'm going to ask you on the exam itself. Make sure you answer these questions in sufficient detail. You can actually go back and review the videos for parts 1 and 2. That would actually be able to answer all those questions as well. But there's only 2 multiple choice questions here. And some of those we're going to talk about here on the exam itself, practice exam itself. All right. Any questions on the study guide? Anything that I did not go over that you need clarification about, or something that I did go over that you need further detail? All right, let's go to the practice exam then. All right, so the first part, I'm just going to go through the multiple choice, and we're just going to talk through those. Which of the following is not a primary activity in the value chain? Okay, so this is actually asking which of the primary activities in the value chain. Outbound logistics, marketing, and inbound logistics are all primary activities. The only one that's a secondary is information technology. Even if you couldn't remember that, you can think about this intuitively. The value chain is going to be direct representation with anything that represents value with an organization. So it's going to be operations. So inbound logistics, marketing, and outbound logistics all represent direct operations with respect to our customers or our vendors. The only one that doesn't directly interact with that is information technology. That's a support activity. Income statement account most likely affected by investment in customer relationship management, CRM, would be, well, we just talked about this. Remember, the key word here is customer, okay? What do customers generate for an organization? They generate revenues. So if we are trying to invest in customer relationship management, we're trying to increase our revenues. Should be A. Question number 3. What accountants use to explain and illustrate how business process systems operate? If you do the math, this is actually the question on chapter 2. Chapter 2 is all about business process documentation, okay? This is going to be documentation. That's all we're talking about. By definition, that's exactly what we're looking at here, documentation. All right, which of the following best describes a business process modeling notation message flow? So keep in mind there's 2 types of flows in a BPMN diagram. There's sequence flows, which are basically saying This is the first step, then you move on to the second step, and so on and so forth. It actually shows the sequence of steps or sequence activities in business process model notation diagram. Then we have flows between either departments or pools, so internal or external participants in the organization or in a process. So basically, we're talking about message flows. We're talking about interactions between participants in a process, whether it be departments within the organization or other organizations that we're interacting with. Question number 5, which of the following is the best description of an association? Okay, so remember, association, we've got those classes in our UML diagrams and those arrows that actually show those classes that actually shows the relationship between those classes. And every time we have a relationship between any class, we depict that with an arrow to show that association, or I shouldn't say arrow, a line to show that association. We don't actually have sequence flows in UML diagrams, it's just a single line. All right. Consider the following customer class table, which of the following attributes in the table would make the best primary key. So remember, according to our entity integrity rule, primary keys have to be unique identifiers of a particular table. Okay. So unique attributes for a particular table. If we're talking about the customer class table, probably something that's going to be a unique identifier of the customer, which would probably be customer ID. A customer name would not necessarily be the same. Email address is probably going to change over time, and postal code, that could be the same for customers. Yes.
What was the answer to number 4 again?
4. The answer number 4 was shows interactions between participants in a process. Yeah, B. All right, so customer ID for number 6. Which of the following correctly describes the entity integrity rule? Let's go ahead and take a look at the entity integrity rule for reference. Okay. Primary keys must have data values. They cannot be null. That's basically all there is to it. Unique identifier must be cannot be null. And now I'm going to the wrong places. So primary key of a table must have data values, but cannot be null. That's A right there. It's almost verbatim. All right. That's the entity integrity rule. What is the main purpose of using foreign keys in a relational data model? All right, so this actually talks about what's the purpose of foreign keys. Keep in mind, a foreign key is just a primary key or a combination of keys from another table. The idea being is if we want to find information from one table and relate it to another table, we can actually pull that from the other table. An example would be here is that everybody in this room is within a table about students at Truman State. You have student information. So your banner ID, your name, your address, your major, things along those lines. You are also part of this course, okay, which is going to be course. I have a course ID, and then it's going to have names of the students in this course. If I wanted to pull additional information related to the students that are specifically enrolled in this course, I could go back to the table that has the student information, the student information table, and pull that based on your banner ID, which is a unique identifier. So banner ID would be an example of a foreign key that I would use for this course, for a table in this course, because I could pull information for everybody that way. So basically linking tables, that's what we're going to be identifying, link the tables, identifying information that's common between tables so we can actually pull information from one direction to another. Which of the following counts is generally not impacted as part of the revenue process? This is just a fancy way of saying which of the following is not included in the revenue process. So revenue process is generally going to be associated with sales. In a business-to-business environment, we're going to generate receivables because we extend credit. We're going to eventually collect cash, and we're going to sell inventory. So which of those did I not list? Accounts payable. Accounts payable is part of the purchasing process, okay? So we're talking about the revenue process. We're going to be focused on the bottom 3, accounts receivable, cash, and inventory. A would not be part of the revenue process. Which of the following best describes the difference between access controls and application controls? Okay, this is kind of an interesting one. So this question does not immediately give you the information because you know the keywords. Access is what employees can do. Application controls is what the system does. But we're looking for some depiction of that relationship, all right? So access controls limit who can change records. So who is going to be our employees. And application controls ensure data integrity and provide an audit trail to any changes. That's what the system is doing. So A looks awfully good, but let's go through the rest, okay? Access controls limit how many records can be changed. No, that would be an application control. Application controls ensure segregation duties. Ironically, that would be an access control. Access controls are prohibited business rules, and application controls are allowed business rules. Neither one are actually business rules. The controls are separate from business rules. Business rules necessitate or mandate controls. So the only one that's correct is A. That's the only representation that we're familiar with, so we can say A is our answer. Which of the following is the most likely order of a basic purchase activity model? All right. So let's go ahead and think about if we're purchasing, what is one of the very first things we want to do? We probably want to talk to our vendor and say, we would like to buy from you. Can you give us a quote? What is that represented by? Request prices and availability. So we can eliminate A and D because those occur later in the process. The question is B or C correct? So request prices and availability, receive items, record accounts payable. Do we have missing steps in B? Yes, we do. And those are dictated by the steps that are represented in C. Place purchase order, receive items, and send payments. Okay. So, yeah. So we can actually say C is our correct answer is the one that actually represents a more holistic version of that sequence. Which of the following would most likely be a foreign key in a purchases table? So remember, by definition, a foreign key is something that would represent a primary key in a different table that could be used to link to the purchases table. So purchase order date, that would not be a primary key in any of the tables, so we can eliminate that. Purchase order number, that would probably be a primary key, but it would be a primary key in the purchases table, all right? So it would not be a foreign key. Product description, that's not a unique identifier, so we can eliminate that. Supplier number, that's definitely going to be a primary key, but in a different table. It'd be a primary key in our supplier table. We could use that and say, if we assume that each purchase only has one supplier, then we can actually link those together. And that's what makes sense. The supplier number is our foreign key, C. Which of the following types of businesses is least likely to employ a conversion process? So conversion, what is conversion usually associated with? Manufacturing, okay? We're talking about manufacturing. Is a restaurant a manufacturing organization? Yes, we don't think of it that way, but they do generally manufacture. That taco that you get from Taco Bell, they have to actually put ingredients on there. It just doesn't come out as the Taco Bell doesn't send it to Taco Bell as taco prepackaged. They actually create it in the restaurant. All right. Retail store. Retail store by definition buys things and resells them as they are. They may break them down into smaller quantities, but it's not a conversion process. It's probably B. Bakery. It's just basically a fancier type of restaurant. Automotive factory is what we traditionally think of as a manufacturing process. So A, C, and D are all manufacturing. They're all employee conversion. B is the only one that doesn't. You could make an argument, say, Dr. Barnes, wouldn't there be a conversion when you actually take a pallet of goods and break it down to several smaller goods? And that's a very loose argument to make. You could actually say there's small conversion. Of the ones listed here, that would be the least likely to employ any kind of true conversion. All right, instead of the following BPM diagram of conversion subprocess, which of the following steps are correct to error in the above diagram? All right, so change the intermediate event to a start event. So we've got this intermediate event right here. Should that go to the start? No, we would need to know what the work is before we can discard errors. Change the intermediate error event to an exclusive gateway. Is there actually any decision here? Maybe, but for the most part, we're kind of ignoring that and say if there's an error, we're just discarding it. We're not trying to make any decisions. Add a sequence below the end event after discard errors activity. What do you guys think about that one? That sounds intuitively correct. So we have this symbol right here, but we have it down here. Okay. That makes sense? Yeah, I think that's probably the most likely scenario, but let's go ahead and drop the activity named discard errors. We're just gonna have a manufacturing process where we sell all of our errors. That's the most efficient scenario. That's a good way to do business, don't you think? Obviously, I'm being facetious. Okay, I'm being facetious. We can't just drop discard errors. We would like to make sure that if it's an error, we don't sell it to the customer. Otherwise, they get their pizza, and the pizza that they order with pepperoni, mushroom, and pineapple is missing an ingredient, and then they're just like very, very unhappy. Not that that happened to me recently or anything. All right. Moving on to Excel. Which of the following is an Excel function used to combine separate pieces of information, either information in specific cells or manually type information to a single cell? That's actually concat, but you can use concatenate. Either one of those is fine. Concat is the more modern version of this. Assume that you're attempting to create an Excel formula that assigns a letter grade based on percentage of points that students earned in the course. Of the functions we've discussed, which of these would be the most useful to the class? That was our example of our nested if statement. But we actually did that. Remember, we said if above 0.895 A, if above 0.795 B, so on and so forth. That's the nested if statement example. Assume that I want to know the quantity of non-blank cells within a certain range of an Excel spreadsheet. Which function would I use? Well, it's going to be count or count A. Which one am I looking for this one? Count A, because if I said count, I'll remember count is exclusive to just numeric inputs, okay? It could actually count and then come up with a result that's wrong because it could ignore something that has a non-numeric input. So count A is our answer for this one. And then Excel Friday discussions I mentioned, and I guess our Excel Wednesday discussion, I mentioned that a newer and more powerful programs have greatly improved visualization and presentation of data over Excel is capable of. However, I did provide an example of a tool in Excel that, like more recent programs, not only allowed the visualization of data, but it enabled filtering and selection of data for presentation was the name of this tool. So this is our pivot chart. This is our pivot chart that we actually integrated a pivot table into a graph and can actually filter through data. This is going to be very similar to our visualization tool that we use in Chapter 11 when we do some Power BI work. So this will be very, very similar to that in nature. Power BI is obviously more potent and more powerful, but it is kind of reminiscent of that. All right, NetSuite. Of the first steps you encounter in setting NetSuite access and assignment of your role in information system, per my instructions, what role are you supposed to have? This is something I harped on many times. We are administrators in NetSuite. The reason why is because we want to have access to all parts of the system. If we don't have that role, we can only access predefined areas. So administrator is an important role to identify there. All right. In NetSuite, I navigate to transactions, then financial. Based on where I appear to be going, what task would I be most likely to perform here? So of the list of tasks, what do we have here? Would it be create a chart, new account of the chart of accounts? No, but that's something you do need to know the process and the sequence for. Would it be enter a journal entry? That is correct. Yes, that's where we appear to be going. Okay. If I was going custom transaction detail report, I'd be going to reports and then custom reports. Set up new accounting periods. That would actually start with setup. Okay. So please make sure you're familiar with the sequences of all these activities that we did and you know where we're going from where. All right, I'm going to jump over to the key, which again, the practice exam key should be available on Brightspace now if you need these answers. All right. So Dear Liz Incorporated is a business stationery supply company located in Kirksville, Missouri. You recently been hired by the company and joined the accounting business staff. Very first task assigned you and supervisor to diagram the company's revenue process and provide you with the following narrative. So let's go ahead and just really quickly identify this narrative. When you're going through the narrative, what I recommend that you do is when you identify an activity that you think needs to be diagrammed to the BPMN model, underline that activity. So customer contacts DLI by phone, email, or through the company's website to inquire about prices. Sales department prepares a quote for products that the customer is interested in. So the customer places a sales order for some of all the products in the DLI quote. For any products not currently in inventory, DLI orders additional inventory from their suppliers. Once all products are ready to be shipped, DLI delivers the product to the customers. DLI then bills the customer and subsequently collects payment. Okay. Now, if you were walking this or noting this really closely, this looks almost identical to our Sunset Graphics depiction. There's actually only one item that I left out of this this narrative. Does anybody catch the item that's not in there? So the Sunset Graphics had an apply graphics step, which because they're a little bit of a service activity there, it's basically the exact diagram as Sunset Graphics. You just had to exclude apply graphics, which if you copy and pasted from the slides and then put this into your answer, I would count off the apply graphics. So you just have to scratch that out. By the way, don't do that on the exam. That would be cheating. Okay. Yeah. Copy and pasting, not allowed. But for the basic BPM diagram of DLI's revenue process, this is all it is. Again, I just used the diagram from Sunset Graphics. You will notice that I do not include the apply graphics step here. All of these are specified in the above narrative. That's how easy it is. Again, when I said that you need to remember the details of the processes, it's pretty straightforward with that. Now, next step asks, in the diagram that you created, that you created in part A, identify the point in the revenue process where revenue recognition would occur. So it occurs where the goods are shipped to the customers, which deliver order. Okay, you'll notice I have this listed in the diagram. I did specify that for all the diagrams you're responsible for, you do have to be able to recognize the transactional events, even if they weren't included in the BPMN diagram that I asked you previously. Okay, so deliver order is where we record the sale, receipt payments, we record the cash receipts. Okay, and you can kind of see my inclusion of this. It's seamless. You can't even tell the difference between that. Yes.
Do we have to add the brackets on the exam?
If I specify a question like this one right here, the answer is yes, or you'd have to tell me right down here, but you don't have to include it. You'd have to put either one here. So you could actually say it up here and say refer to this above diagram, or you could just say revenue recognition occurs because it shipped to the customer. So answer is not necessarily, but it's fine if you do. All right, so prepare the journal entry, record the sales transaction. This is an old journal entry that should be familiar to you. Question comes up, if I ask you this question on the exam and you only put one half of the journal entry, would it be wrong? The answer is yes, it would be wrong. You have to recognize both sales transaction and the cost of goods sold transaction, because both of those are relevant to the transaction process. And then you notice that I copy and paste, I said DU again. Identify the point in the revenue process the cash receipt occur and prepare the entry to record the cash receipt. Again, you can tell me right down here where it occurs, or you can actually show it in the diagram to receive payment, and then you need to recognize the transaction. So that's where we collect cash, the debit, and credit our accounts receivable. Yes.
On part B, if we just did the first half, do you give partial credit or do you do it also?
Oh, I'd give you partial credit,
Okay.
but you would not get full credit for just half. So. I'm a big one for partial credit. I probably should mention that as well. So some of the questions that may come up may link to one another, may link to something on the process. So if you say, for example, answer a question incorrectly early on, and then you use that information in a subsequent question, I will grade, or more specifically, my grader will grade the subsequent question based on the information that you provided, not on what the correct information is, okay? This may come up in, like, for example, a UML diagram, you incorrectly identify a certain class, and then you're trying to represent the multiplicities, and you're trying to, as long as your depiction of the relationship is correct for what you put down there, I will still give you credit on that, okay? That's an excellent question to ask. All right. UML diagram for sales quotes, a partial diagram is shown below. Which of the multiplicities for the association between quotes and multiplicities and pair this interpretation of association? Okay. So first of all, important point here. This is not a one-size-fits-all model. Okay. This is what I would recommend for this particular answer, that this one should be 0 to 1, and this one should, or sorry, 0 to many, and this one should be 1 to 1. Okay. If you put down one that is rational and reasonable, that's different from this answer, I would accept that. Okay. You can make an argument that quotes could be prepared by multiple employees. A quote has to be prepared by at least one employee. You couldn't make an argument that a quote prepared by no employees, because then quotes just start appearing out of the ether. Unless you want to make an argument that a quote could be prepared by the system and so employees are not involved. That would be a great argument, by the way. But you'd have to actually include that as your argument on the description. So if you do something other than a 1-to-1 here, you're trying to say quotes are created by something other than one employee and only one employee. Which again, I would accept that argument if you can describe the argument. If you put one to many here and then say quotes are prepared by one employee and only one employee, that would be dead wrong. Okay. So there's room for interpretation here. Keep in mind that they need to be rational associations. Okay. So if I say employees can, if you say 0 to 1 here, for example, say employees can prepare one quote, but they can only prepare a maximum of one quote. Or employees can prepare 0 quotes, but a maximum of 1. I would say, so we have to hire a new employee every time we want to sign a new quote. That would be kind of silly. Okay. So it need to be at least somewhat reasonable. But in this particular scenario, the one that we've already looked at is 0 to many here and 1 to 1. This is basically saying quotes are prepared by one employee and only one employee. And then employees can be responsible for 0 quotes. They may not work in that business area, but they can prepare many quotes. That I think is the most rational interpretation, the one I expect on the exam. Clarification though, I will accept different answers if you can justify those answers. All right, based on the narrative begin the problem, identify the additional resource events and agents should be included in the complete UML diagram of the DLI revenue process. So I'm saying here, if we wanted to prepare a complete diagram, what do we need to add? The good news is all of our agents are here, okay? Also for products or for resources, we only need to add one more resource, that's cash, because that's what we trade products for, all right? As far as the events that we're looking at, we're gonna have an order event and we're gonna have a cash receipt event. That's kind of the standard model. So then I asked you to prepare the diagram. You did not need to include the multiplicities, but your relationship should look like this, okay? Remember, our employees and customers relates to all of our events, but our products and cash only relates to quotes and orders for products and cash sheets here. This is a diagram that I asked you to be able to replicate, so I would expect you to be able to replicate that for the exam. All right. Any other questions? I do not have official office hours tomorrow, but if you need to come see me or talk to me and I'm not in my office, shoot me an email. If I'm not available, I will try to tell you when I will be available. Best of luck in studies. We'll see you all on Friday.